Today, I'm going to be wearing more of my philosophical hat, as it were. I also have a degree in theoretical philosophy, so I'm going to be giving you the broad overview of the methodological and theoretical ideas of why in Helsinki, in my group, we do our research in the way we do. So yes, I'm a cognitive scientist from Helsinki. My topic today will be cognitive science in the wild with the subtitle, How Not to Do It. I put the not into parentheses because I'm going to tell you also a little bit about how to do it, but that would be a longer talk, which I would then follow up with the concrete examples. But I'm going to be reflecting it against some of the ways we are in cognitive science maybe too often are not taking a naturalistic or, as it were, ecological approach enough to understand cognitive behaviors and processes of the mind and the brain in natural contexts. So also featuring here is Jami Pekkanen, a postdoc from my group, with whom we just released this preprint from which you can read in a bit more detail the ideas and their background, and also more on the aspect of how to do it. Okay, so just as a preamble, I'm going to tell you about the focus of my talk, what its scope is and what lies outside the scope. So maybe this is something that is very close to what you are doing, or it might be different, but this is what we do. So our mission, as it were, is doing cognitive science in the wild. And what do I mean by that? I mean understanding stuff that people actually do. And by understanding, I mean here in a somewhat narrow scope, understanding human behavior and its basis in the way that cognitive science understands things. So measuring and modeling the principles and mechanisms behind intelligent behavior in a broad sense. And by intelligent behavior, I mean some kind of adaptive behavior in a complex environment that is partially predictable. This is how I would define the mission statement of cognitive science broadly. Okay, and then cognitive science in the wild means understanding in this particular way stuff people actually do. So by that I mean roughly the sorts of things that people do outside the lab. Even when no experimenter has invited them to the lab, given them some stimuli or some task that the researcher is interested in, and then instructions to carry out that task in a particular way. This is, of course, how psychologists, maybe human factors engineers, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists tend to do research. But to what extent that actually tells you about then the thing that we are interested in. Well, I'm interested in stuff people actually do outside the lab is the question of today's presentation. Basically, when I say outside the lab, I mean tasks which are structured in a way that there are no given instructions, no trial structure a priori fitted, no response buttons that you reduce the behavior into like this discrete timed movements of the finger, and where there may be even the stimuli, at least in experimental psychology, are often reduced into kinds of beeps and flashes and very reduced displays. So what I mean and what I'm interested in to understand in my research broadly is what I would call the cognitive basis of everyday and expert performance, the things we are able to do in our everyday lives, and if we decide to develop our skills in a particular way to an expert level in the world at large, or as I use the term, in the wild. These are what I would consider examples intelligent behavior in the broad sense. So when I say intelligent behavior, cognitive science wants to understand intelligent behavior. I don't mean intelligence tests or even academic tests or achievements, but these kinds of tasks which require the kind of intelligence that we humans seem to have in spades. Whereas, for example, these are just the kinds of tasks which are very, very difficult to make a machine to do. If you think about artificial intelligence, then of all of these, like a firefighter, a sushi chef, a tea harvester, a tennis player, a violin player, a person drinking a cup of tea, and chess player, only the chess player is something that, well, AI can beat a human being hands down. Modern AI is vastly better at the particular task of chess than any human being has ever existed on this planet or is likely to ever exist. But for all of these other tasks, machines can't do it. You can't imagine, well, maybe you can imagine, but nobody knows how to build a machine that could make sushi or put out fires. Actually, people don't even know how to make a machine that could play chess, in the sense that if you have to actually move the pieces, it becomes a very, very difficult artificial intelligence problem or robotics problem. So if you confine the problem to the domain of chess, just selecting the moves according to the rules of chess, this is the task where artificial intelligence beats humans hands down and is vastly better, but humans are vastly better at actually playing chess in the sense that you have to select the move and actually move the pieces. For humans, moving the pieces is kind of the easy bit, and selecting the right move is the hard bit. Whereas for artificial intelligence, selecting the move is, relatively speaking, the easy bit. It's a cracked problem. Moving the pieces, the physical pieces of the board, is the hard bit. So in that sense, human intelligence in the broad sense is different from artificial intelligence, the kind of intelligence that currently we are able to build into machines, or AI engineers are able to build into machines. And it's this kind of intelligence. What are the properties of the mind and the brain that make all this possible is what I'm interested in. Right, and my thesis here will be that you have to take a certain kind of methodological and theoretical approach to studying human beings to then make headway into this problem. Now, yes, as mentioned, the sub-problem or the class of problems within this broader interesting topic is what I would call high-speed locomotion, and especially eye movements and gaze behavior, and how we control, through gaze control, our movement at high speed in different kinds of environments, as you can see, for example, in surfing or downhill skiing or mountain biking or fast driving. And our empirical work, or my empirical work at least, is mostly on the topic of driving, which I approach as an example of this broader set of interesting behaviors that humans are capable of doing, but machines are not. I think it is a particularly fruitful one in that actually, if you think of artificial and robotics, they are getting closer. We are not seeing tennis robots or sushi robots anywhere near the horizon, but of course autonomous cars and autonomous race cars even are on the cards. So I think this is an area where this interest in the human aspect of the intelligence and what people can actually engineer into machines are getting closer to one another. Okay, so that's broadly where I'm coming at this from. But whereas my kind of personal fixation is on driving, you can think of the same problems in any domain of human behavior. You might be more interested through your research or through your hobbies or whatever. I think for any this kind of real world domain, as Ulrich Neisser once put it, finding out what really happens in the world will be worth knowing. And we don't at the moment. So if you think of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, all those tricky behaviors, those rich, complex behaviors, we really don't know how humans do it. We have some fragments here and there, but we don't have the big picture. And I would submit that one reason we do not have the big picture is that the research as it's being done generally in experimental psychology and neuroscience is not, as it were, ecological enough. The way we empirically approach the problem of understanding the cognitive basis of everyday and expert performance in the wild should be more ecological. Okay, and then the meat of this presentation will be to explain to you what I mean by the term ecological in this context. I will start with two things that I don't mean when I say ecological, or when we make the manifesto, the preprint manifesto on ecological cognitive science. There are some expectations people have about what makes a psychological experiment ecologically valid, or what makes a scientific research question or a cognitive science research question ecological. Now, I want to clear out those preconceptions first. Two ways, I think, not to be ecological. Then I'll tell you in a few words what we think are being ecological, or what we think being ecological is about. Okay, and then a few words of reflection in the end, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Starting with the first way not to be ecological, which I frame in terms of what I call a naturalist versus experimentalist divide in the history of psychology, neuroscience, maybe even AI, although it's not so big there. Okay. One thing people sometimes expect or even misperceive my message to be is that to be ecological, you need to do field experiment. You need to go out into the wild and observe what's actually happening there to understand cognition in the wild. I am not saying that. This is not what I mean by being ecological. Sometimes it is useful for the ecological approach, but of the 10 principles of what we call ecological cognitive science, that is only one. So that is doing field experiments or making observations of what people actually do out in the wild is only one out of the 10. So, and there's a trade-off to be made. When you go out into the wild, the messier your data is going to be, and the harder time you are going to have interpreting it. So yes, you are improving on some sort of representative, but you are trading it off against being able to properly understand what is happening. And the aim of ecological cognitive science is to understand stuff people actually do out in the world. So going for maximal ecological representativeness is not always the best thing if you want to be ecological cognitive scientist. Okay, so to be ecological is not to value naturalistic observation over experimental rigor. I don't know how big this divide is in your field. In my field, it is very big, and I think it has been getting, and is getting bigger over the years. So if you think about the history from, let's say, early 20th century, we had on one side various schools of thought which emphasize measurement, manipulation of controlled situations, and numerical precise data, behaviorism, cognitive psychology, basically all modern neuroscience and brain imaging. We walked by a fMRI facility on the way here this morning. They would be squarely on this side of the divide. And then if you think like late 19th century, early 20th century neurology, Jean-Martin Charcot in Salpêtrière and so on, ethologists, Konrad Lorenz here in Austria, Nicolas Tinbergen in Denmark, ethologists within biology were on the naturalist side, and Gestalt psychologists, I would submit, were in opposition to behaviorists and cognitive psychologists on the other side. But that's a discussion to be had with historians of psychology. But this is a side which values starting with the natural conditions, looking at the real behavior and making observations out there in the real world and developing ideas on the basis of that. And I think, it seems to me, that this rift is getting wider and wider. There are some voices in the literature like Gibson's ecological psychology, Neisser, whom I mentioned, his study of everyday memory in the 1970s, and Hutchins, who did a Murrayan analysis of cognition in the wild in the 90s, that try to bridge this. They are very much out of the mainstream. This is not how people usually approach it. So I think this is a real problem in psychology, in neuroscience, brain imaging, and also therefore cognitive science, which borrows many of the concepts and methods from there. Okay, so you want to reduce or bridge this gap in some way. Now, how to do it? Now I'm going to show the other way how not to do it, in my view. So you want to bridge the gap between, let's say, people who emphasize the value of doing foundational or rigorous basic research in the laboratory over more applied real-world problems, and how people often conceive of this connection, or how this connection gets established, is like this. This is the basic picture most people have in mind, both on the basic side and on the applied side, that there is a thing called basic academic research or fundamental research, which uses rigorous experiment and analytic methods to come up with fundamental theory which can then be applied to whatever like real-world behavior we are interested in, perhaps interested in from a societal perspective, that we can, if we understood these behaviors, we could monetize it or weaponize it or get some other extra scientific outside of the interest of science benefit, and that's why it's called applied. Now, this, I think, is somewhat of a myth of the relationship between basic research and applied research. And doing this is not what I have in mind when I say that cognitive science should be more ecological. And more than that, I'm not saying that this is the ecological side and then this is the non-ecological side. Those would be like, that's not what I'm saying. So if you think that, then you're thinking differently from me, and I will try to explain to you now how I think of it. Okay, so one of the problems that the kind of mindset shown in the previous slide engenders is, to me, that it leads people, especially people on the experimental side, the rigorous side, the fMRI researchers who are confined perforce to the lab because they can't take their machine out into the wild, thinking that, well, it's okay, we do fundamental research and we find out what the fundamental laws of the human mind or the basic principles of the brain are. And then they wishfully think that applications will somehow take care of themselves, or that somebody else with an applied interest will take care of the applications for them. They can just concentrate on understanding behavior of their subjects in the laboratory, and they don't have to worry about applied problems like driving, because that's like a little bit maybe even beneath a proper fundamental scientists. So the applied people are not dealing with the pure science. And I think this is wrong. This is not a productive way to look at it. But also, I do not think, or my view of being ecological is not to either to work in areas where there are some tangible real-world applications in the sense that there are these financial, economical, or military or whatever benefits outside of science. I'm interested just in in the pure science, only I want to make the science ecological. And you can contrast the two ways of thinking about it. The way I don't think it often works, and that is counterproductive, and the way I think it often works, and that would be more productive and make the research more ecological in this way. So on the top we have here the traditional picture, the idea that you have here the pure fundamental research, as it were. You have some intellectual challenge for the academic researchers who develop then through experiment a theory of some phenomenon. Here you see this fellow lecturing to this bird on the aerodynamics of feathers, right? He develops through rigorous experimentation in his wind tunnel. This is of course like a metaphor or an analogy. I'm thinking about cognition, but if we are thinking about instead feathers, you run the story this way. So this fellow is lecturing to the duck about the aerodynamic properties of feathers that he is trying to understand from first principles. And then lo and behold, he watches the ducks fly away and he goes, wow, my theory really works. I lectured to the duck about how to fly, and there they go. Look at them go. However, I don't think that that's often how it happens. Okay, this is kind of an illusion we, especially in the academia, often like to have because it makes us feel better and more relevant. But I don't think it's often true. And I don't think historically that's often how we have learned to understand complex phenomena and complex behavior. Aerodynamics being a case in point. It wasn't that people derived the principles of aerodynamics from Newtonian principles as an application. And then based on that and some wind tunnel testing, they were able to devise aircraft and jet engines. No, they looked at bird flight. Actually, they looked at bird flight, and then they built gliders, and then they tried to build powered aircraft, powered heavier than air or denser than air aircraft. And the Wright brothers, well, they used wind tunnels, but still they had to do field experiments and actually scrap a lot of the numbers they were getting from the literature from other wind tunnels. They were tinkering with the phenomenon, trying to understand it, trying to develop then the concepts that would apply to this interesting phenomenon. And then you bring it to more experimental control. Once you have developed the theory, to be able to test your ideas, to pinpoint causes and effects, to analyze and dissect and diagnose what actually follows from Y, from what, whether X follows from Y. And this is how it often works. You start with this strange thing that is happening. You see the birds go there, and then over time, you develop the science to understand that. And then that gives you intellectual satisfaction. And these people are here, I think, then saluting themselves with some champagne after a successful experiment. And the ducks might even learn something interesting or worthwhile to them. So the duck will come to listen and say, well, how do you here, with your theoretical concepts, understand what it is I am doing? And this is, I think, often how it happens, or how it happens when it works. In psychology, we tend to think according to the first or the top line of thought. And unfortunately, I think as a consequence, a lot of psychology doesn't work. It doesn't have proper applications where you could really predict some phenomena or explain what is happening in a rigorous way. So this is one of the underlying causes of the malady, if you will. I may be being a bit negative here, and just shooting at my own field, but that was the title of the presentation, how not to do it. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so having diagnosed, identified some of the ways not to be ecological, and hinted at the direction of how to be ecological. I'm now going to be looking a little bit about the symptoms of this malady and how they might be ameliorated. So we present this as 10 rules for an ecological approach to cognitive science, or the 10 axioms of ECS, if you will, although I'll tell you they're sort of axioms, but they're not really, are they? Okay, so this is now the part about how then to be ecological in your research. And many of these will probably or might apply to your field, even though you are not cognitive scientists, because it's about how to be scientific about any human behavior or any real world problem that you want to understand. Maybe some of them will fit your field better, and maybe some of them will fit first. Will not fit so good, so you'll have to judge for yourself. Okay, but this is how to be ecological in your research. If you want to be a cognitive scientist in the wild, if you want to be some other kind of scientist, you can pick and choose from these if you see that they are interesting and relevant for your particular problems. Okay, and this is quite a dense slide, but let's go through all of these in order. So here are the 3 principles of ecological cognitive science, as Yami and I see it. It's just something we came up with for this talk. So it's still a work in progress, but this is how we think about it. We have tried here to condense or extract all the things we have done when we have practically tried to measure, model, and understand human beings in these interesting tasks that we have been looking at over the past 10 years, and also condense the philosophical discussions and the principles that we diagnose in why we choose to do things in one way rather than another. So these 10 years are kind of the condensated extract of our joint 10 years of, well, joint 20 years, 10 years to the man of working on these problems. Okay, and these principles, we have categorized them roughly into four principles on the relationship between the organism and the world, or the person and the task, or the human and the environment, and 3 principles on the internal design of organisms as we see it, and then 3 principles that are really not specific to the ecological approach and not specific to cognitive science even, but just some of the principles to do good basic science in any field. Okay, so the first 4 would be about in the wild, and the 3 would be about cognition, and these 3 would be about science, so cognitive science in the wild. Okay, so the principles, the first 4: ecology, complexity, uncertainty, and dynamics. Ecology of naturalism, by that we refer to the idea, the naturalist idea, that was the end of the previous section, where you start with the interesting behavior, observations of the real world natural behavior, and try to bring that into the laboratory, try to bring that under analytic control. You simplify what you see in the wild, you derive your experimental tasks, your data collection methods, your signal analysis decisions, your statistics, you derive those from your consideration of what's the real world task environment that I'm trying to capture in my experiment or in my analysis or through my theory. Okay, then the second one is complexity, which is something that psychologists, oddly enough, at least experimental psychologists, often need to be reminded of. So it has 2 parts. First is that organisms, like humans, are pretty complicated. Their behavior is more varied and rich and nuanced than your theory says it does. You can't model it all. Your model has to be simpler than the creature you are trying to model. If it was as complicated as the creature itself, you wouldn't gain any much understanding because the model would be too complex for you to understand. So there is an inherent complexity in any complicated creature that you are trying to look at. For example, a race car driver. Yet, for any organism, even sometimes you hear it said that, the human brain is the most complicated object in the known universe. Okay, but the universe is still big. It's much bigger than a brain. So no matter how complicated and rich your brain and how varied your behavior, the world is always going to be more complicated than you. So the second principle is that there is this asymmetry in the complexity of organisms and the complexity of the world, meaning that organisms have to adapt or must have evolved to survive in a world that is much more complicated than them and sometimes hostile. So organisms need to have developed ways to deal with excess complexity in the world compared to your internal complexity. If you think of, for example, many artificial neural network AI systems nowadays, they are hugely complex, and the complexity of the system might be closer and not orders of magnitude different from the complexity of the data it gets fed. Insofar as that would be the case, then the second principle of complexity is violated. You are not gaining understanding of how a simple creature, relatively speaking, can survive in a complex world. Okay, then almost as a consequence of complexity, there is the principle of uncertainty. So because the world is more complex than you, it's more complex than any belief system you can build inside your head. Therefore, there must be uncertainty. You cannot know everything about the world. All behavior and all decisions that you make as a creature in the wild have to be made under conditions of uncertainty. Okay, and then the final one is dynamics. And this is something that's really important. It's important to stress it to psychologists, but to anybody who's thinking of doing experimental work, is the principle of dynamics, that perception, cognition, and action occur over time and in interrelationship or in interaction with the world. So normal behavior, any normal behavior you care to look at in the world, is a closed loop behavior where the world presents to you some stimuli which you perceive, but you also act on the world. You change your conditions, or you just change your point of vantage on the world. So now I'm moving here, and I see it from a different perspective. I am controlling the stimulus that is being presented to me. You are not controlling the stimulus that is presented to me. You look like what you look like, but I am controlling the point of vantage. This is not the case in most psychological experiments, where you place somebody in a chamber, you present some stimuli, some task, and then they press the response button. But the response button doesn't do anything to the stimulus. The psychologist doesn't like to give control over what is happening to the subject. They want to make it an open loop or a one-way street. Either they want to look at the perception side or the motor side, but they don't want to close the loop, because that leads to troubles in modeling the situation, and especially with the kind of statistics people usually like to use. It becomes really hard to statistically analyze the behavior when it's this kind of interactive behavior. And this reminds you that is what most behavior is always like. Look at any creature out there, and that is what the world looks like to them. They are interacting with the world. Okay, then three, these are about our ideas about what we think then humans or other animals look like from the inside. One is integration. Once the organism is able to perceive some information visually or auditorily or haptically or store it in memory, if that information is relevant to the task they need to get done, they will find a way to use that information. So your job as a researcher is to find where is the useful information and how is this person picking it up and putting it to use. So the information, if it's there, you can't say that, okay, I have given an instruction, you are to focus on these stimuli and ignore these ones as irrelevant. No, just because you give the instruction, if they seem useful to the person, they will use that information. An organism tries to integrate all the information it tries to it considers as useful. And if you ignore that, then your model of the organism is going to be awry. But then within that, trying to integrate all the useful information, there is a tension with the sixth principle, which is frugality, which is that people or creatures try to get by with as little information as they can, especially with as little information processing as they can. So by and large, for the human mind or the brain, memory is cheap. It has a huge capacity to store information. The vastness of long-term memory is really quite awesome. There's no end. You can't store so much information into a human brain that it would run out of capacity over a period of 100 years or so. There's always room for more. So there's a huge amount of storage. And it's organized in a fantastic way that when the relevant information is there, it tends to get found out, and you can apply it like that. If you're an expert, you can see what the situation calls for. So those are kind of cheap cognitive processes, but thinking and reasoning and figuring out the next step of things, that's really hard. So with that, especially, humans try to be as frugal as they can. If they can get by in your task without thinking too much about it, that's what they will try to do. Memory is cheap, but thinking is expensive, and humans try to be really frugal with thinking, even as philosophers and academics. And then there's one final one, and this is the one that is most subtle, and we are still struggling how to actually formulate it. But it's that when you evaluate and measure and put into numbers the behavior, the performance of the person you are looking at, then you need to start with those performance measures that are actually valid and reasonable and representative of the behavior that you're interested in. Start with the performance measures that actually make a difference and which the organism cares about, what your subject cares about, not those which are interesting to you or what you care about as a researcher. So try to find the ecologically valid and representative performance measures to actually define what is optimality or what is an error in the experiment you are running. Okay, and then finally, 3 ones, and these are kind of more general ways to do good science. So parsimony, you have probably many of you heard about Occam's razor. So do not postulate constructs, parameters, or unobservable processes beyond what is needed to actually account for the behavior observed. Full specification. So this is specific to the way understanding in science or cognitive science develops. You need to put your ideas sooner or later into some kind of mathematical or computational model, because otherwise you just don't know what your theory entails. If you try to run a complex theory just on intuition or verbal descriptions or suggestive labels in boxes with arrows in between, it's not going to work. Oops, sorry. It's not going to work the way you think it should work. Only once you implement it and are able to specify it fully, will you be actually able to know what your theory actually says or predicts. And within that, then you don't want like Deus ex machina type thinking boxes or skyhooks or something built in just to make the behavior come out right, that are kind of put there by hand. It should be specified from some kind of first principles. But the first principles should not be like your philosophical ideas. And that's the final principle, no metaphysics, which Yami insisted should be no metaphysics exclamation mark. So you can't judge your first principles just on the basis of what you think the mind, what you think a mind is like, or what's your take on mind and matter, or the problem of consciousness, or whatever, or just generally your philosophical ideas about how you think the universe is put together. You judge your models on the basis of their fit to data. and especially on the basis of their non-fit to data, if you are being properly falsificationist, that you can actually rule out some theoretical explanations, and then they are out, even if they are metaphysically appealing to you. Okay, I will just close with this reflective bit, which is explaining to you why we decided to describe or name these 10 principles as the axioms of ecological cognitive science and not 10 commandments. But there being 10, we were of course tempted to think about to name them the 10 commandments of ecological cognitive science, and that's what it originally was. But then when we thought about it a little bit more, we thought, okay, it's not like the law of Moses. It's more like Plato, Aristotle, or maybe Euclid, in that if you think of, well, this is not a careful theological argument. I mean, we could argue also about the theology, and like, I don't want to attribute this to Moshe actually, but just as a metaphor, you can think of the 10 commandments as giving the law of Moses or the law of ecological cognitive science. And if you break one of the rules, you have broken the law. Okay, that's the idea I want to convey with this. So they make an indivisible whole. And if you fulfill them all, you have fulfilled the law. If you break any of them, you have broken the law. Okay, but that is not how we think about these 10 principles. We think them more as, well, not that self-evident, but hopefully on reflection, self-evident enough principles that are, as far as possible, logically independent. We try to make them logically independent the way mathematicians like to make axioms in an axiomatic system logically independent. It's aesthetically pleasing to have independent axioms, and people were worried about whether the parallel axiom is actually a separate axiom or whether it can be derived from the others. So saying they are axioms, we are emphasizing that we like to think of them as 10 rules, each of which you can abide or violate. And then you can score your own experiment or your own research question or your own theory or your own research proposal, if you are presenting a research proposal for grants or whatever. If you want to say, well, am I doing this according to the way this ecological cognitive science is supposed to work, you grade yourself on each of the 10 points. Do I score or not? And then you get a grade from 0 to 10 on how ecologically cognitive scientific you are. Okay, and that works if they are indeed logically independent, that you can pick and choose and mix and match them as you go along. And then in the paper we present more do's and don'ts on how to be cognitive scientist in the wild. And the idea of thinking of them axioms is that if you adhere to these basic principles, then you must do your research in the way these methodological consequences are explained. If you don't, and you accept that this is like the axiomatic system, then you are not doing ecological cognitive science. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying this is what we want to do. And if you want to do that thing which we call ecological cognitive science, that's what you would do. And the motivation to bring you back is that what David Marr said, what he wrote, and this is again metaphorizing to the problem of bird flight. Trying to understand perception by studying only neurons is like trying to understand bird flight by studying only feathers. It just can't be done. In order to study bird flight, we have to understand aerodynamics. Only then do the structure of the feathers and the different shapes of bird wings make sense.